beautiful image?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so before I picked up a camera, this is the first photo that I fell in love with. It's taken by Julia Margaret Cameron in 1869. And I love the imperfections of this picture, the scratches in the print. And if you look really closely, you can see one of her hairs probably dropped in the print in the dark room, almost as if she became part of the photo. She was an aristocrat, and she photographed an allegorical world made from the women who surrounded her. And she's possibly the first well-known female photographer that I know of. And it's the intimacy in this photo that really strikes me. You see, photography at this time was mostly posed kind of formal portraits or landscapes. And this photo started to communicate kind of a shared human experience. So I went to UNC. This is supposed to be a black slide. I went to UNC to study art and writing and left the university. UNC is the University of North Carolina. And I left the university as a photojournalist. My first job was at the Concord Monitor in New Hampshire, and it's a very small town newspaper. And it's here that I decided to do a photo column focusing on the everyday moments in life with words and photos. So this was in the 1990s. And these images that you see are literally cut out of the newspaper because there is no online record of this anymore. This is like pre most of the internet, which is crazy how fast is technology. But I found that I love photography, simply put, because I love people. I think that they're weird and ugly, beautiful and fun and sad and confusing and ridiculous and joyous. And the idea behind the column was that everyone has a story. Sometimes I approached it like a game. I drive in one direction for like 10.4 miles. I told myself I'd stop my car and follow the first person that I see. Photography is a chance for people to see a mirror of themselves, getting people to relate to each other and sometimes finding the simple joy in someone's eyes. And I learned that empathy was the key to the work I yearned to create, the intimacy I found in Julia Margaret Cameron's work. And I never considered going to war. That wasn't something that I had ever planned on doing. When 9/11 happened, I was a news staff photographer for the Washington Post. And then when the Iraq War was imminent, I was sent almost last minute. I accepted the challenge like an adventure, but I had no idea that I would find myself in the middle of things or that I would stay for 7 years. Here in the days just after the fall of Baghdad, a Marine threatens a man who was robbing a bank. We were in the back of an armored personnel carrier, and I was probably only 2 feet away. I have a note here about technology. Again, if you notice, some of my older images from Iraq are very low resolution. And for those younger folks here, this was pretty much the first event where I held a digital camera. We saved an entire day of photos on one burned CD that had like 800 megabytes available. There were no portable hard drives, at least none that I had access to. And I remember reading the owner's manual to my first digital camera and my new laptop on the plane ride over to Iraq to cover the war. I also witnessed a strange and huge disconnect between this war zone and the country that brought it to this point, the United States. Life in Iraq was a gruesome ritual of suicide bombings, hospitals, patrols, and roadside bombs. I have a couple of images in this first section that are a little intense. So just to give you a little warning. So I would photograph the scene of a bombing, the hospitals if there were survivors, the morgue, and then the funeral, sometimes all in one day. I stayed and stayed and stayed in Iraq, not for the adrenaline rush that many hear about, but to try to end this never-ending feeling of failure to get people in the United States to pay attention. Then I continued onto other war zones. Here, I was on the rooftop with a family in Gaza whom I lived with for several days, watching bombs fall not too far away, shaking the cement beneath me. And I often live with the people I cover. And here, the intimacy and love that exists no matter which side of a war one finds themselves on, because no one really wins a war. This was taken at a funeral for a Syrian soldier in Assad's army. You can see, again, the echoes of the work that I first fell in love with by Julia Margaret Cameron. It's unintentional, but it's weird how you can look back in your work and see what has inspired you in this way. And I want to encourage you all again, if you have any questions about what I'm covering, I'm going through a lot of things really fast, but please feel free to ask. I found that honest and often harsh war images are necessary. Photography freezes a real moment in time forever, and being upset by an image, enraged or sickened, I think is good. Getting people to look and ask questions is necessary in order to learn and survive as a country or as humans. But I also realized that people don't care about someone in a different culture or language or religion or situation unless they can relate to them first. So back in Baghdad, I returned to the idea of my New Hampshire photo column. The Washington Post allowed me to create a weekly space called Unseen Iraq, a window into the everyday life of Iraqis living in a war zone. Reporting Unseen Iraq was my favorite part of the week. I thought about my readers, people in Washington, D.C., walking to their office after battling traffic, or even the President of the United States, and wrote about Qasim Ali. I wrote, he waits for his ride on Al Mawal Street near Baghdad's Sadr City district. A minibus, one of many stuck in traffic, will take him and other government workers to the Ministry of Trade, where he has worked for 30 years. This is his Monday morning commute. The street is heavy with trash and car exhaust. Street dogs on the sidewalks, school children jump puddles of sewage, and a donkey bays at his driver's sharp whip. And here, a family reunion. She was not able to see her parents and niece for over a year due to the steady violence surrounding Ramadi, which subsided for a few months at this time. And here, a fisherman tries to cool off in the morning, fighting Iraq's impatient sun. Because of the military convoys and main streets cut off from traffic, driving through Baghdad was often impossible. The fishermen on the Tigris River became river taxis. And here, a dust storm. Best friends who are told to come home before the streetlights come on, something my mom used to tell me when growing up in small towns. And beauty contests, things people normally don't see from Iraq. Little Miriam in this photo was homeless. Her family owned a house next to one of Saddam's palaces, which was bombed, and they lived with various extended family members. She's praying here with her mother. The columns embrace the weirdness in people too, individual personalities. Here, a Kurdish man exercises. So I feel honored to be a female photographer covering Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly when I did. And I was somehow allowed to be in a man's space, probably because I'm a foreigner. And I was allowed to photograph women. So like Julia Margaret Cameron, I was able to photograph the almost hidden world of women there. And to stay sane during extended periods of time in these areas, I dove into long-term stories. One of these stories I decided to report on a profession that tends to thrive in wartime, which is prostitution. This is Hala, and she was the first person to ask me about the word democracy. I, I interviewed almost 40 women who practiced prostitution before I met Hala, a woman who wanted to tell her story, who didn't ask for money, and she was well aware of the possible consequences of the story. She was very brave. Hala's husband had died in the violence that followed the fall of Baghdad. I wanted to share a different voice, one we don't normally hear from, to describe this war. To support her children and extended family, she was forced into prostitution. In places like Iraq, real jobs for women were rarely accepted. If they aren't taken in by a family, they were normally pushed into the streets begging or forced into prostitution. My style is often imperfect. I like blurred images, images you can feel, images that feel to me like real life. Here, Hala was lit by the oil lamps because electricity was also very scarce. In here, she negotiates with a man from Fallujah. She became my best friend for the year that I followed her. I spent all of my spare time in her apartment where her little boys played, often under the eye of her next customer. She wore most of her money, afraid it would be stolen, Iraqi dinars on the left side of her bra and US dollars on the right. Here, Hala is with one of her customers. She moved apartments several times in that year as Iraq became more and more conservative. Prostitutes were heavily targeted. And here she's in bed with a customer, which was an interesting situation. We had talked many times about how to take pictures that really show what prostitution means, because I think not unless you really understand that prostitution is selling your body, do people really understand the weight of that. And we talked many times about how do we get this picture? Hala and I were like, oh, should I hide in the closet? And they were like, no, we'll both be killed. And then one day a local university man came to the door, and I was with the translator, and we just asked him, do you mind if we take pictures? I think honesty is usually the best way to do stories. And he said, sure, as long as you don't show my face. And then very oddly afterwards, we all had tea, which is very strange. But of course, this is the reason why she does what she does. It's her children. And through her body language here, you can tell that she's given everything to them. And this is, I think, one of my favorite images because of her and what she goes through. Headscarves were simply, it's just a piece of cloth. But it became problematic for me in this job, not because I had to wear them, but because it created another visual divide or difference between Iraqis and most of my audience. I found many of our readers couldn't get over headscarves, burqas, or abayas without thinking of these women as scary, kind of ghost-like creatures. For a short while, some Iraqi communities were finding jobs for women who had lost their husbands in the violence. Their job was to body search other women at checkpoints. And at the time, some women were being used as suicide bombers. So this is something that was needed. I attempted a portrait series of these widows, not only to tell their story, but also hoping that when you see them, one after the other, you focus on the individual personalities of these brave women, and that the headscarves, the abayas, they melt away, and you see the rage and the sadness and the empty resignation, the doubt, their determination, and their anger. You see them as individuals. I
One question about how you communicated with your subjects. Amy is asking, do you speak Arabic or Pashto Farsi?
I studied Arabic the whole time. I lived in Iraq for 7 years, but I never became fluent. I know enough to try to stay out of trouble or know if I'm in the middle of trouble. But I always had translators. I did not attempt to know Pashto or Farsi because even Arabic is really tough, because I also covered Egypt and Lebanon and other countries that spoke Arabic, and their dialects are so different that it's almost like learning different languages altogether, and it really messed me up. So in order to really be able to communicate with people well, I always had a translator with me, always. It just became a better way to communicate than off of my spotty Arabic. So, and I do that with every country I go to. I also work with what people sometimes call fixers, not only in other countries, but also in the United States. And that's usually just a trusted member of the community that can bring you in and introduce you to people, and also make sure that you don't kind of rely on stereotypes that that you may not be aware of yourself. So someone who can really check you and who you can ask questions like, so it looks like the story is this. Am I hitting this right, or is this the right idea, or am I totally off? Am I, kind of American gaze not representing things adequately? So I really find working with a team of people wherever I am, whether it's the United States or the next town over, or Iraq or Afghanistan, really important to make sure that you get it right, because you have a big responsibility when you cover somebody else's community, no matter where it is.
Did you have a bodyguard? Was another question.
There were a couple of years in Iraq that were really dangerous, and it wasn't a bodyguard, but if we traveled somewhere, the most dangerous time was when we were in cars traveling to a location, because there would be like suddenly a checkpoint, a point of people who are trying to kidnap someone or something like that. So we normally would have a kind of a chase car, a car that kind of quietly followed us, not obviously followed us. And someone who, if I was out in a marketplace during those 2 years, they would follow kind of like far behind me, so no one would know they were there, but they would always have their eyes on me. And that was nice because I worked for the Washington Post, and they took care of us. I think they're, Iraq in 2003 was not too, I mean, it was dangerous, but not so dangerous, but it steadily got worse and worse and worse. And so it was needed, and the Washington Post took care of us. And I find that with the New York Times and National Geographic too, that's the important reason why you have to work with a company that can really look out for you in places like that. Cool. Okay, so this is another warning that there's a photo coming up of a child who died. So I just wanted to let you guys know. 1 year, I spent a lot of time in the camps of displaced people living around Kabul, Afghanistan. In the tens of thousands of displaced people from war-torn Afghanistan, many displaced people were from the south and not used to the beautiful snow around Kabul. Kabul, much like probably places that you know very well, has a very high altitude, and so it is much colder than the rest of Afghanistan. It's almost like a large city on a plateau. So children like this little boy were freezing to death in the camps. And the Afghan government said that the people in the camps were lying. So when it happened again, the camp leaders called me and I was allowed to go into a room of women where they were washing and mourning the loss of life. So this is a situation where you see the importance of journalism because they really didn't, the Afghan government did not want these displaced camps to exist. They wanted these people to go. And there were like over 10,000 people living in these camps. They thought of them as an eyesore. They didn't want this responsibility. So they weren't allowing NGOs or anyone to help people in these camps. So they hoped that they would leave. This photo of this child who froze to death ran on the front page of the New York Times. And the reaction to it was really intense. The Afghan government, the US military, aid organizations, and individual people all took action to help the displaced in these camps. And it made me think, what is it about some photos that gets people to pay attention and others not? I had seen pictures of children who had died in war or in other situations before, and I was not getting the same reaction from the public. But here, I think it was again about getting people to react or relate to each other. And this photo ran just days after Christmas. And it echoes much of the imagery from the nativity scene that I think people from the West are used to. The deep connections, drawing some weird but deep connections between cultures. But this kind of reaction to a photo has only happened to me a handful of times in the 20 years that I've been a professional photographer. The chaos I covered overseas made me curious about what people in my own country think democracy means. A country that often exports the idea of democracy in a place where people are willing to die for it. And so I began to document our society's connection to this widely used and often misunderstood concept to find a better answer than the definition I gave Hala years ago when she asked me, what does democracy mean? When Hala asked me what democracy meant, I gave her a very like textbook kind of answer. And she answered, oh, I thought democracy meant money. I thought you were all going to make us rich in the US coming to Iraq. And so, so I found it really interesting to ask people in the US, what do you think democracy means in practice? What if I was going to take pictures of democracy, what does that look like? Here in Virginia, people line up at a police training station to vote in elections. So this was one photo. In this study, this exploration, it was supported by National Geographic and Catchlight and Photo Wings. We went from community to community asking people their thoughts. We were a team of 3 journalists, including a talented academic named Rebecca Sanchez, a videographer named Lorraine Ustaris, and we held discussions in classrooms, libraries, town halls, knitting circles, and coal miner training areas, asking, what does democracy look like in our lives firsthand? And the first thing people mention when they talk about democracy are elections. And is that a true gauge of democracy? And what does that mean in a country where historically a majority of Americans don't vote? We traveled to areas of the US with the highest number of non-voters, like El Paso on the border. The people we met here were scared to talk about politics. They avoided involvement in a direct form. And then we drove down into the Valley of Welch, West Virginia. It's like taking a beautiful drive to the bottom of the earth. The 2-lane road became darker and darker as the mountains and trees seemed to grow taller and you'd fall deeper into this valley. cell service and internet access disappeared. I found asking, what does democracy mean to you, requires a deep understanding of people in these photos. In this way, the project attempts to bridge today's deep political divide to understand that people don't actually exist down party lines. And I found many counter narratives to a lot of cliches. For example, here in Trump country, many people were actually Democrats, which I found surprising. Because a lot of people were union people. In North Carolina, I followed NRA supporting hunters, conservatives, but not in every vein. They are very traditional environmentalists, close to nature, and they believe in the climate change that has affected their coastal community deeply. And in Memphis, this couple belongs to a gang. The gang has a leader who enforces school attendance, good grades, and helps families in need. And in a city known for inequality and racism, it raises really interesting questions about what happens and who steps in when the system fails those living in our democracy. I went to Elizabeth City, North Carolina after the killing of Andrew Brown Jr. Possibly the second definition of democracy I often hear is freedom of speech and protest. And though I set out to examine the political divide in the Our Democracy Project, what I found was something much more pressing. It's a democracy divide of sorts. I found that regardless of one's cultural or geographical, political or racial differences, socioeconomic inequality is what defines whether people feel they have access to democracy, whether they feel they have power to change to create change in their life for the better. It's the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And this is a ferry that brings people to Pamlico County, North Carolina, which is now where I live and also where I went to high school. This brought me back to small town USA, where I grew up. While still working as a freelance photographer for National Geographic, I now also do a weekly bulletin called Down in the County for Pamlico County in the rural South, similar to the photo columns that I did in New Hampshire and Iraq, to help my own community define itself through its people with the help of journalism, instead of defining the community through the politics that so often divides it. Trying to, again, get people to pay attention. And this is a talented cook at a local grill called the Flamingo Grill. Here, brothers, they live beside each other in a trailer park. They're taking in the sunset after a long day of work. And here, the last day of deer hunting season. And this woman could no longer take care of her dogs the way she wanted to. She had to give them away. This is a local farmer. His name is Bossy, or they call him Bossy. He also considers himself a historian. These stories may seem trivial, but really it's about trying to heal a divided country within one county in its everyday life, an experiment in a way in one county. This is a commercial fisherman aboard his shrimp trawler. And prom, which just happened last week. Stories that cut through the divisiveness. And it's really about the approach that I take. I think that allows these to be successful and allows them to get support. And that is that I really try to bring politics out of it. Ideas. This kind of brings me back to the ideas of democracy, which has really been my focus all along. Like, what does it mean, really? And that is important to me because I think that how do we know how to fight for it or how to stand up for it if we don't really know what it means? to everyone if we don't have a common definition of this word. Here, this is a famous photo that you must all know, I'm sure. But I wanted to quote a 1943 New Yorker writer, E.B. White, who saw it this way. It is the don't and don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea which hasn't been disproved yet. A song, the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. So that is kind of the focus of my career as of now. And I continue to work locally to see if I can get people to define the community differently and to get people to believe in journalism again. We also have it's a news desert here. So we have one other publication, but it's a conspiracy theorist based weekly newspaper that's free and on every countertop of every business in the county.
Can you talk about a little bit more about that project and how it's funded and kind of how you're operating right now?
Sure. So Facebook, so, you know, a year ago or 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was covering right before the last presidential election. I had to cover a lot of rallies, and some of them were Trump rallies. And I asked everyone, where did they get their news? And their answer was almost always Facebook. That's where they got their news. And I took note of that. And I thought, then I saw this call from Facebook for independent freelance writers or journalists to cover their own community. And I thought, okay, I'm not the biggest fan of Facebook, but I'm going to maybe see if this would be something I'd be interested in. And so they have started independently without any editorial control. They kind of hired on a bunch of local journalists to provide content. And it's not posted on Facebook. It's actually a newsletter that's emailed out to people that people subscribe to every week. And it's been really successful. So they helped kind of with a startup fee. And it's enough just to kind of help me survive a little bit. I still have to do my own freelance work, but they support, they accepted my proposal and my work. So they've been doing that with quite a few people. And I think it's been good. It's been really popular in the county. And I like that it's emailed out to people instead of only on a platform. I think that it's a little more interesting that way. And yeah, it's been, we have about 10,000 people in the county, and I have over 5,000 people subscribing. So some of those people are from Afghanistan and Iraq, but most of them are from the county. So it's been really good. I think people really want to see themselves as something that's just as important to write about as, you know, an artist in New York City or a school teacher in Washington, D.C. We have all of the problems that the rest of the country have in this one county, and I'm sure all of you guys have them too. We have drug addiction issues, we have poverty, we have over a 30% poverty rate. We have like fishermen and farmers and loggers, and we have climate change issues. We have lots of hurricanes that are coming harder and harder, hitting harder. So we have a lot of the things that the rest of the US definitely deals with as well.
We have a question about the portrait series of the women in the scarves. What do the white sashes on some of those women signify?
Yeah, those were basically for the US military so that the US military could kind of recognize them, like, okay, these women are supposed to be here. They're official in their own way. So some of them were upside down and some of them, but they were basically just to make sure people knew that they were official, workers in the checkpoints.
Another question is, has social media changed how you work, your approach to photo series or projects that you look for?
No, maybe I'm old fashioned. I'm on Instagram, and I like Instagram because I'm a photographer and I like seeing what people take pictures of all around the world, whether they're well known or not. But I'm not really on Facebook. I think the biggest problem for me with social media is that when you publish a photo of someone, you're really like putting them up for a lot of critique and issues from commenters. And I hate that. I'm more protective, I think, of the people that I cover. So I also do something really, something that journalists don't normally do with these columns. And that is, in order to gain their trust, I let people read the column before I publish it. And that's basically involving them in the process, which I think is really important. It's gone really well. I encourage people to do it if they can. I mean, I know with hard-hitting news or investigative pieces, that's impossible. But for simple community news like I'm doing, it's made people realize that, I'm really trying to get it right. And they trust me because of that.
Can you talk about other ways in which you build trust with the people in your, small town? How do those webs of trust work, and how do you contribute to them to help give you more access to people who are all over the map?
Yeah, I mean, I went to high school here, so that's a bonus. I think that helps. Even though I've been gone since I graduated from high school, my mom and my sister still live here. The town that I live in actually has only 800 people, so it's very, very small. But to get to know the community well, I kind of pinpointed key community people to cover and to go talk to when I first started this. So I talked to the sheriff, I talked to Bossy, the historian, I talked to, specific people who have respect in different, there's a woman named Teresa Badger who is like a huge leader in the Black community here. Like I made sure that I talked to all those people and found out what they thought was important to cover. What do they want to see? And I had those same discussions. I go to the high school and give presentations. I'm involved in the community. And one of the bulletins that I do every month is also a list of events, because we have no centralized place for all the events that happen in the county. And though there are not many events in the county, there's still like, track meets and, knitting circles. And, there are different things that are happening. The library has, events. And so knowing about those events and becoming kind of the person that people see, I think also helps their trust in me. I'm not hiding, and I'm really transparent. One thing I did not expect covering, and I'm sure many of you have to deal with this a lot, and that is when you are a local journalist. This is just something that I hadn't dealt with since New Hampshire. And I think it's even more intense now when you're covering your own community. People trust you more, but they also hold you more accountable. And that can sometimes be a little scary, especially when your own child, is going to go to these high school or the school system, and people know where you live, and that can be really scary sometimes. And I have to watch myself. Like, I don't want to edit what I see. I want to make sure that I'm telling the truth. I just it's a tricky line that I don't know if I've mastered completely. I think it's just about honesty, though. I think when I tell a story, I try not to be staying away from politics is like the number one key for me. I just have to. And unfortunately, in today's world, almost everything is about politics. So even talking about, the pandemic or, the economy, it can be political. But if you focus on individual people and you make it about their experience and not your take on their experience, then I feel like it's more successful.
Will you talk about what the ingredients are in your town for you when you're like, okay, that seems like a story to me? What and in particular, what you've learned about, how you maybe changed that recipe a little bit as you watched what resonates in your town? What makes a story that finds an audience in your small place?
I think this is a community that has been kicked around a lot. It's kind of a community that's a bit forgotten or feels forgotten. And even though, it's a very diverse community. We have like 40% Black community, and then the rest is like Hispanic and white. It's it's pretty close to, it's 30% below the poverty rate. So it's tough. So people have a hard time, their education system is not great. The health system is not great. Like all of the things that people rely on, there aren't that many jobs available. So I think that the thing that people like about this is that the individual stories bring pride into the community. Not really on purpose. That wasn't what I set out to do necessarily. But in a way it was also like, we are important. Each individual, like this is such a huge world with so many people in it that people feel invisible. They feel so unimportant that when you say, no, like your life is incredibly important and it's universal, like you deal with a lot of the issues that people in Alaska deal with, and your life is important. I want to follow, I'm going to follow you and talk about your history, your family's history, like your town's history, and write it down. And it has no other purpose than just that. It's not political. It's not like I'm trying to sway people and anything else. It's just about you. Then I think then people go for it. People love that. It sounds really simple, but really, when it comes down to it, the divide in our country scares me. And I've seen that divide overseas and other places grow into something that's like a war. And I don't want that to happen in our country because no one wins that. And so even these small acts of trying to get people to relate to each other, even if they have different political views, but they have all the common interests. Their kids go to the same school, they all go to the same hospital, they all have the same choice of jobs in front of them. They all deal with hurricanes the same way. It's those things are not different, and those are the things that really matter. So I want to remind people of that.
Thank you so much. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions if anybody wants to put one in any of these various feeds. You can do it in the Q&A or the chat. All right. Okay. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. And you should get up here. Lots of thank you. This has been amazing. Coming. You should get up here. We'll take you around. And also just so the participants know, if you check the chat, there's a survey that you can fill out on this session. Please RSVP for the awards. And in Anchorage, we have an upcoming event at King Street Brewery. And also we have money if you want in your Alaska town to fund a little gathering of journalists on your own. All right, Andrea, thank you so much. Have an awesome day, and hope you get your t-shirts soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Take care.
Okay, bye.